So let me begin with a simple geometric interpretation of linear maps. So whatever maps we are considering will be maps between finite dimensional spaces over C or R. So you can imagine the space as Cn or Rn. Okay, if it is of dimension n, it is over C, it is Cn, otherwise it is Rn. So by Cn, I mean the n tuples of complex numbers with the usual component-wise addition and scalar multiplication, and so on. So I hope all of you are familiar with such a structure on Cn. Now I will consider linear maps on Cn or Rn, or in general some Cn to Cm or something like that. So in this lecture, we will be considering linear maps between spaces of different dimension most of the time. So that is where singular value decomposition is more important. So now what do you mean by a linear map? A function between two vector spaces which preserve the vector space structure. That means you can see that this is the vector space structure of addition. So if ax plus y will be mapped onto ax plus ay, where a is a map between two linear spaces. And the scalar multiplication, cx will be mapped onto c into ax. Okay. So the vector space structures are preserved. That's what you demand for a linear transformation. Okay. And if some of you are not familiar with linear transformations, then you just imagine about a matrix. That's all. So in finite dimensional space, I will not distinguish between linear transformations and matrices. So I will treat them as the same, because it's a classical result in linear algebra that you can fix a basis for a vector space in a finite dimensional space. You can fix a basis. I think some of you have not muted. Right? Yeah, it's clear now. So you can fix a basis and consider the action of the operator linear transformation on that basis, and you can write down the matrix associated with the linear transformation. So every linear transformation, corresponding to every linear transformation, you can associate a m by n matrix. Similarly, every m by n matrix will give you a linear transformation. So this is something very nice about finite dimensional spaces, operators on finite dimensional spaces. So we will be considering linear transformation of finite dimensional spaces. And if some of you are not comfortable with linear transformation, just imagine that I'm considering only some m by n matrices. Okay. And you know that it acts as left multiplication as a linear transformation. So you act this matrix on the left of a column of size n or something. So then you'll get another column of size m. So it will be a linear transformation between C and C. So that is a way in which we define a linear transformation. Now we observe some very important geometric properties of a linear map. So what are they? It tells you that linear transformation will map lines into lines. In particular, it will transform parallel lines into parallel lines. Let us prove this observation first. It's a very simple thing to prove. So what do you mean by a line? So suppose L is a line passing through the point P in the direction, say, R, direction of that vector, a unit vector R. So what happens? It has a parameterized form like this. L will be of the form P plus T into R, but T runs over all real line. So this is the line equation of a parameterized equation of a line, okay, which pass through P. Now what happens if you, so remember here P is a vector and R is a unit vector and T is a scalar, I mean P belongs to R, okay. So what happens if you apply a linear transformation on this line? So every vector on this line, if you apply linear transformation, what happens? Use linearity. A of this will be A of P plus, so T will come outside because T is a scalar. So A of P plus T into AR with T belongs to R. So now this is the image of this line, right? Now look at this. This is again another line passing through the point A of P in the direction A of R. Okay, so lines are mapped onto the lines. Now what happens to parallel lines? So by parallel lines, I mean they are in the same direction or in the opposite direction. So that's how it is done. So for example, L1 and L2 are parallel means you'll have P1 and P2. They may pass through different points, but it will be of this form, P1 plus TR and P2 plus TR. Now if you apply A here, what happens? First line will be mapped onto AP1 plus TAR. Second line will be mapped onto AT2 plus TAR. This is by simple linearity. Now what happens? This is a line passing through AP1 in the direction AR. This is another line passing through AP2, but in the same direction. So that means same direction or opposite direction, depending on this. But that means they are parallel again. Okay. So this is a very important property regarding the linear transformation. So I wanted to mention this because most of the time when you deal with linear algebraic things, you miss the geometry. So let us begin with some geometry. So let us consider some other examples. I mean, some examples of linear transformations, which are very important in a geometric point of view. So I will consider rotations and reflections. So what do you mean by rotation? So for example, you consider R2. So on R2, you consider a vector, you rotate it through the angle theta. You fix theta, and you consider every vector, you rotate it over an angle theta. So simply a rotation. Okay. So now you can see that every vector in R2 will be rotated, right? So now this gives you a linear transformation on R2. That's the thing. So that is again something you can very easily observe. What we do, we compute the metrics associated with the linear transformation with respect to the standard basis. In R2, this forms this E1 and E2, where E1 is 1, 0 and E2 is 0, 1. This will form a basis, standard basis. This is known as standard basis. Okay. So what do you mean by basis? Any element in R2, you can write it as a unique linear combination of these two vectors. Okay. Because R2 elements will look like XY, right? Ordered pair XY. So you can write X into 1, 0 plus Y into 0, 1. So anything can be written in this form. Now you look at the action of A. I mean, A is rotation by the angle theta here on this basis vectors. So 1, 0 is actually the vector on the real line. If you rotate it angle by an angle theta, it will be rotated in an angle theta to this direction, in the direction of theta. Then again, 0, 1, again you look at that. So then you can see that the rotated line, that endpoint will have the, means simple trigonometry, you will obtain that their coefficients will be cos theta and sin theta. So E1, if you apply A1 will be cos theta, sin theta. Similarly, AE2 will be minus sin theta, cos theta. This is simple trigonometry. I mean, you are taking a unit vector and rotating by the angle theta. So then this will be the matrix. So this matrix represents the rotation on R2. Now, what is a reflection with respect to x-axis? So what do you mean by reflection with respect to x-axis? You look at a vector, then you just reflect it. So just consider the mirror image as we place the mirror on the real line. That's all. So then its mirror image will be in the lower half plane. So that is, so if you consider an upper half plane vector in the upper half plane, its mirror image will be in the lower half plane. So in other words, what happens? XY, the points XY will be mapped onto X minus Y, because you can see that the real coordinate will not be changing, but the imaginary part, I mean the imaginary line coordinate, Y coordinate will be changing. So you can again see that 1, 0 will be fixed because 1, 0 lying on the real line, it may not be fixed. So it will be fixed. And 0, 1 will be mapped onto 0 minus 1. So that's why you get the matrix to be this 1, 0, 0 minus 1. Okay. Now both these matrix satisfy this identity. A transpose equal to identity equal to A transpose E. So what do you mean by transpose? Just take the transpose. I mean, just replace the columns by rows and rows by columns. That's all. So that is something you are familiar with. And this is a simple computation which all of you can do. A transpose is identity, and A transpose is also identity. Now, what we have seen is that if you consider rotation or reflection, that satisfies this property. Now, what we are going to see is that any matrix satisfying this property will be a combination of such rotations and reflections. So that's in some sense a converse of this. So let us prove this. So if a linear transformation R2 satisfies this identity, then it is a combination of rotations and reflections. So let us see what happens. So this is the proof. You start from a matrix or linear transformation which satisfies A transpose equal identity equal to A transpose A. Then you know that there is an angle between the vector 1, 0 and its image under A. that is A of 1, 0. So you consider that angle, say you call it theta, and consider the linear transformation, that is rotation by the angle this theta, where theta is the angle between 1, 0 and A of 1, 0. Okay. So you got a linear transformation R, which is a rotation by the angle theta. Now you consider this matrix or the linear transformation B is equal to R inverse A. So what happens to the vector 1, 0 under this linear transformation? 1, 0, if you act A first, then it will go to A of 1, 0. Now you are acting R inverse on that. See, R maps 1, 0 to A 1, 0. So R inverse will map A 1, 0 to 1, 0 itself. Or in other words, B, this transformation fixes the vector 1, 0. So once it fixes the vector 1, 0, as we see, so here, its matrix with respect to this basis, the first column will be 1, 0 itself. Now you can easily see by simple computation that B also satisfies B transpose equal to B transpose B equal to identity. And this property tells you that the columns of B will be orthonormal to each other. What do you mean by orthogonal to orthonormal? Orthogonality means they are in the dot product will be 0. That means you can see that B transpose means you are taking the first row of B and first row of B here also, right? I mean, because we are taking B transpose, that means the first column will be the first row of B. So you are taking the usual means component-wise multiplication and addition. That is the scalar product of that, and that is 1. So first column and first row, the product is 1, but first row with all other product will be 0 because you need to get an identity matrix. So only when the same column you are taking in a product, you get 1, and otherwise it is 0. That means their columns will be orthonormal to each other. So therefore, here you already got the first column to be 1, 0. So anything orthogonal to that should have 0 here and some element here. Okay. Now you know that determine B equal to plus or minus 1 from this identity. So for that, B should be plus or minus 1. So B should be plus or minus 1. That means this matrix is actually 1, 0, 0, 1 or 1, 0, 0, minus 1. Or in both cases, that means B is either identity or B is this reflection. B is a reflection. So B is either a reflection or the identity map. If B is identity, what happens? You get A equal to R itself. If B is the reflection, you get A equal to R into B. So A equal to R into B. R is a rotation and B is a reflection. So you obtain that any transformation satisfying this is a combination of rotations and reflections. Okay. Now with these preliminaries, we are going to we need one more thing. I mean, so this is the basic action of rotation and reflection. Now the third thing is a diagonal matrix. So how does diagonal matrix act on R2? You will consider a diagonal matrix like this. Its action is A of xy will be Ax by, right? So it's a kind of scaling in some sense. Okay. So the vector xy is scaled onto the vector Ax by. Okay. Now, what singular value decomposition will tell you that any linear transformation on R2, R3 as well, is a combination of rotations, reflections, and scaling. So that is a geometrically, that is what very nice about it. You start from any linear transformation or any matrix, in other words, it will be a combination of these three geometrically important matrices or operators. Now, a simple notation which I will use is A star. A star is the adjoint of A. That means you take transpose and also you take the conjugate of the entries. So if we are on the real field, then A star is A transpose itself. But if you are in the complex case, A star is not merely A transpose. You have to take the conjugate also. That's it. Now we are here with singular value decomposition. This is the most important result which we will discuss today. In fact, this is the only result which we are discussing today. All other results are simply as an application of this. Okay. So let us spend some time on this singular value decomposition. So you begin with a M by N matrix with real or complex entries. Then the decomposition tells you that any such matrix. So remember, you are dealing with a rectangular matrix. Need not be a square matrix. That's one. That's a very important thing. So singular value decomposition tells you that any such matrix can be written as this form. it has a decomposition into the product of three matrices U, D, V star, where the first U and second V star, U and V satisfies the property that they have U star equal to identity equal to U star U, and same with V. That means they are unitary matrices. They are known as unitary matrices. Okay. I mean, in the real case, they are rotations or reflections. You know, we have already seen that they are rotations or reflections. Okay. So U and V are such matrices, and D is a diagonal matrix. Sorry, D is not a diagonal matrix, but something close to diagonal. So D will have, so that is because of the size of the matrix A. So D will have the size of this form. I mean, D will be of this form. I mean, there will be a diagonal matrix here and some zero rows below that, provided M is greater than N. If it is the other way, the zeros will be on here, on the right side. Okay. M equal to N, it's a diagonal matrix. Okay. So there will be a diagonal matrix coming into picture, which you can call say D1 or something. So D1 will be here and several zero rows will be below that. And D1 will be here and several zero rows on the right, columns on the right of it. So these are the only choice of D. So it is like a diagonal rectangular matrix. Okay. And what are these diagonal entries? Sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma n. They are non-negative real numbers. Okay. Sigma 1 greater than, so of course, you can arrange it in a decreasing order. That is also important. So in fact, this is not unique. You can go to other way of ordering. So sigma 1 greater than or equal to sigma 2 greater than or equal, etc. Sigma m greater than or equal to 0. Remember, this can be 0, but this cannot be negative. So they are real numbers. So you begin with a complex matrix. I mean, it can be a complex matrix, but you will end up with a real matrix here. Your D will be a real matrix, not merely real. It is positive semi-definite in some sense. I mean, all the entries on the diagonal are non-negative, but it can be 0. So this is singular value decomposition. We will not prove this singular value decomposition today, but what we are going to see some consequence of this singular value decomposition. Okay. Now, before going to the consequence, let us first see the geometrical interpretation of this singular value decomposition. So let us begin with a 2 by 2 invertible matrix with the real entries. Okay. So since they are real entries, you don't have to take the conjugate. So the single value decomposition will be this: A equal to U D V transpose. Okay. So that's what you have for real matrices. With U obviously satisfying this orthogonal transformation, and V is also that. And since this is diagonal of order M equal to N, 2 is the order, so D will be sigma 1, sigma 2. I mean, you have a diagonal matrix. Okay. And also, we have considered an invertible matrix. So a matrix is invertible, then its determinant will be non-zero. So you apply determinant property of a determinant here. Look at this transformation, this decomposition. Dit A is on the left-hand side, dit of this on the right-hand side. But dit of A, B, C is dit A into dit B into dit C, right? So dit U into dit D into dit determinant of V of transpose. But determinant of U and determinant of V transpose will be plus or minus 1 only. So they will never become 0. Therefore, determinant D cannot be 0 because the product is determinant of A, which cannot be 0. So here the determinant is sigma 1 into sigma 2, right? That cannot be 0. That means sigma 1 or sigma 2 cannot be 0. Therefore, you have sigma 1 greater than or equal to sigma 2 strictly greater than 0. Okay, that is very important. Okay. Now let us find out the image of the unit circle under this transformation. Okay. So what is a unit circle? They are set of all xy with x square plus y square equal to 1. Now, under the linear transform A, what happens? A acting on xy gives you A, you can replace by UD V transpose. So UD V transpose acting at xy. Now V transpose is, we have seen that it's either it's a combination of reflection and what you call rotation. So it will be maximum reflected or rotated, but a unit circle after rotation and reflection will not go anywhere. It will still remain as unit circle itself. So V transpose will not make any change in the unit circle. So this part is taken care. Now the action of D comes into picture. So what happens to D? D is a scaling. So what happens? D acting at xy will give you sigma 1 x into sigma 2 y. If you call it UV, then you can see that u by sigma 1 is x and u by sigma 2 is y. So u square by sigma 1 square plus u square by v square by sigma 2 square equal to x square plus y square. But x and y are from the unit circle, so this is equal to 1. That means you got an ellipse. So it is u square by sigma 1 square plus v square by sigma 2 square equal to 1. This is the image of D, image after applying D. Now one more u is remaining. So again, u is an orthogonal transformation. We have seen that there is simply rotates or reflects. So this ellipse will be rotated or reflects the ellipse. That's all. So geometrically, it will look like this. Initially, you had a circle. Once you apply V transformation, it will V transpose. Then it will simply rotate or reflect. It will still remain as a circle. Now, once you apply D, it will become an ellipse like this. And then again, you apply U, then it can be rotated like this. So this is the transformation. Now look at this ellipse. Its equation is u square by sigma 1 square plus v square by sigma 2 square equal to 1. So this sigma 1 and sigma 2, they are the magnitude of the semi-major axis. Semi-axis, I mean major axis is sigma 1 and minor axis. So these lines. So this is the geometry behind the single value decomposition. So whatever sigma i's you are getting, they are basically the magnitude of the semi-axis obtained like this as an image of the unit circle. Now, in fact, you can generalize this geometric notion into several other settings, but we are not going to do that. Let me make it very simple. So the numbers appearing sigma 1, sigma 2, etc., appearing in the single value decomposition, which I will denote by SVD, are called the singular values. So they are called the singular values of A. These are positive square roots of the eigenvalues of the matrix A star A. That is another way of computing that. You can compute A star A and look, it will be a square matrix, and you can compute the eigenvalues of that. And you can see that they are non-negative always, and you can have a positive square root. So that is again singular value. So you can obtain it in two ways. Okay. Now another important remark. So what happens? So this is the summary. In general, the SVD means A equal to UD V transpose. It breaks down any invertible linear transformation A on Rn into the composition of three geometrical transformations: a rotation or reflection first, followed by a scaling, that is D, then again followed by another rotation or reflection. So this is what geometrically a singular value decomposition. Okay. Now we are going to see some applications of singular value decomposition. So first important application of single value decomposition, which we are going to discuss, is about its application to compute the Moore-Penrose inverse, or something called the generalized inverse or pseudo inverse, whatever. So this is something we are going to introduce. Pseudo inverse or Moore-Penrose inverse. By the way, the name Penrose is Roger Penrose. I hope most of you are familiar with this name now, because newspaper mentioned this name recently. He won the Nobel Prize for Physics for his study in regarding black holes very recently, this month itself. That is the Roger Penrose, and this is the same Penrose. So and that itself tells you that these objects are coming quite naturally from physics problems. Okay, the pseudo inverse is a notion which comes quite naturally in the study of physics, several physical phenomena. Okay, so this is not merely for the mathematics, merely a mathematician's cup of tea. That is something I will mention at the end of the lecture also. So what is a pseudo inverse? See, if you have a square matrix which is invertible, then you know how to compute the inverse, A inverse, how to compute the A inverse in some sense. And what is the use of A inverse? If you have an equation like Ax equal to y or Ax equal to b, then you can obtain the solution X by simply taking A inverse of b. So this is the advantage of having an inverse. So the pseudo inverse or Moore-Penrose inverse is a kind of generalization of this, in the sense, in several situations, the inverse need not exist. So what will we do in those situations to compute the solutions? Even the matrix is not invertible, such system of linear equation may or may not have solutions. So if they have solutions, how to compute that in the absence of an inverse? So there the role of Moore-Penrose inverse coming into picture. And the second question, in the absence of inverse and in the absence of solution, what's the best thing you can do? You cannot find the solution because solution does not exist. But then what you can do, you can find something which is close to the solution. So there also Moore-Penrose inverse will help you. So this is something which I am going to discuss now. Before that, let me formally define what is a pseudo-inverse. I will denote it by A dagger. This is a notation for dagger. So pseudo-inverse of A is defined to be the unique matrix A dagger satisfying these four conditions. What are the four conditions? The first condition, you have A dagger, A equal to A. That means if two A's are coming in the equation, left and right, and middle you have A dagger, that means right hand side you have A. And the other way, A dagger, two A dagger comes left and right, and middle you have A, that means right hand side you will have A dagger. So that's the thing. So in both these identities, you know that number of A and number of A daggers will be same. So that is the thing. Now the third thing is tells you that A dagger, the adjoint is A dagger itself. Same with A dagger A. That's the fourth thing. And this thing and this together with this, you can see that A dagger square will be A dagger itself. That is easy. A dagger square means A dagger with A dagger. That means you are just putting an A dagger here. Okay. So that means right hand side you have an A dagger here. So its square is A dagger. Same with A dagger A. So what happens that you can see that these conditions will tell you that A dagger and A dagger A, they are orthogonal projections. What do you mean by an orthogonal projection? Maps which satisfies P equal to P square equal to P star. Such maps are known as orthogonal projections. And these conditions will tell you that A dagger and A dagger A are orthogonal projections. Suppose you had an inverse, A inverse axis, then all these actions are trivially satisfied because A inverse comes here means this becomes identity. So A equal to A. Again, this becomes identity. A dagger equal to A. Again, this becomes identity. So identity satisfies all these conditions. So pseudo inverse means you cannot demand identity, A dagger to be identity. Instead, something close to that. And A dagger and A dagger A, which were identity in the case of classical inverse, in this case, they are orthogonal projections, which satisfy P equal to P square equal to P star. We will use these properties. And in fact, this property has some geometrical importance, which we will discuss a little bit later. Okay. Now, naturally, once we define something, the question is whether it exists or unique. If it exists, whether it is unique. Uniqueness is a very important question because only when it is unique we can define it as a pseudo inverse. Otherwise, one person will compute A dagger in some way, and he will get something, some matrix as A dagger, and other person, if computed, he will get something else, say B dagger. So this need not be the same. So with the abuse of notation, let me prove that. Let me assume that A dagger and B dagger satisfy this condition 1 to 4. That means to become a pseudo inverse of A. So this notation is not good, but still. So I want to prove that A dagger equal to B dagger, right? First of all, let us look at this identity. You start from A dagger. Here, the first thing A you can replace by A B dagger A, because B dagger satisfies the condition 1. So A can be replaced by this. Now this is A B dagger with A dagger. Now A B dagger will be A B dagger star because of the condition 3. And A dagger will be A dagger star, again with A dagger satisfy the condition 3. Now we apply the typical property of transpose, conjugate transpose. That means A B star will be B star A star. So if you apply this both sides, you will obtain this. Now here you take B dagger star and the other terms together. So this is here it is A star, A dagger star, A star, which is actually A dagger A all star. So again, now here A dagger A, because A dagger satisfies condition 1. So this is equal to A. So this is B dagger star A star. So this is again you can write it as A B dagger all star. which is by the fourth condition A B dagger itself. So finally you obtain that A dagger equal to A B dagger. Similarly, we will get A dagger A will be equal to B dagger A. Okay. Now with these identities, you begin with A dagger. A dagger is equal to, by condition 2. So what is condition 2? Look at the condition 2. Yeah. So A dagger will be equal to A dagger A dagger. That's the condition 2. So this is equal to A dagger A dagger. Now with this, A dagger A will be, A dagger will be replaced by A B dagger. So you replace the second, last two things by A B dagger. And now the first two things you can replace from here, you can replace by B dagger A. And again, condition 2 will tell you that this is equal to B dagger. So A dagger equal to B dagger. So this settles the issues of uniqueness. So if A dagger exists, that is unique. Now regarding existence. See, suppose you begin with a scalar. A scalar can also be treated as a matrix, right? So suppose X is a scalar, real or complex. Then what is X dagger? You define it to be 1 by X if X is non-zero and it is 0 otherwise. Okay, so this is the typical thing which we do. And you know that 1 by X is actually inverse of X, so that is naturally will satisfy everything. 0 also will satisfy this identity trivially. So X dagger is this function. Okay. So in general, every matrix with real or complex entries will have a pseudo inverse, Moore-Penrose inverse, which is called A dagger. But we will not prove existence in that way. Instead, we directly provide an explicit method to compute A dagger using SVD. That's where SVD becomes very important. SVD provides a method or an algorithm to compute A dagger directly. So once we compute it, then it's a straightforward thing that there's no question of existence. Okay. Yeah, we will move step by step. First of all, let us consider the A dagger or pseudo inverse of a diagonal matrix. You look at a diagonal matrix, n by n diagonal matrix with diagonal, on the diagonal you have sigma 1, sigma 2, etc., sigma n. Then the Moore-Penrose inverse of D is obtained by D dagger, where D dagger is the diagonal matrix with diagonal entries are replaced by its dagger. That means if sigma 1 is non-zero, it is 1 by sigma 1. And if sigma 1 is 0, it is 0. So that is how do we obtain D dagger. So it is a simple exercise. I leave to the students to verify that a diagonal matrix D, if you define D dagger to be this, then that will satisfy all the conditions 1 to 4. That is a very easy computation for you. We need to compute D dagger D equal to D dagger D itself and all other computations. It's very easy because diagonal matrix computation simply multiply the diagonal entries component by. So that's a very easy thing to verify. Now we look at D of the form D1 0. That means you have a diagonal matrix and some 0 columns on the right. Then you look at D dagger to be D1 dagger. D1 dagger you can compute from this because D1 is a diagonal matrix, and put as many zeros you need here on below of that. Okay. Then it is an easy thing to verify that this is actually D dagger. I mean, this satisfies all the conditions from 1 to 4. Similarly, if D is of this form, D1, a diagonal matrix and several zeros below that, then D dagger will be D1 dagger and as many zeros on the right hand side. Okay, as many 0 columns. So whenever you have D of these forms, you have a particular way to compute the D dagger. That is easy. Now we prove that using SVD, you have Moore-Penrose inverse for every m by n matrix. So you start from a m by n matrix with real or complex entries. SVD is A equal to UD V star. Okay, where you start satisfy this and so on. D is a m by n matrix of this form. Yeah, that is very important. D has the form diagonal with some zeros on the right side or diagonal with some zeros below. Where D1 will be a diagonal matrix. Okay. Now with direct computation, we can prove that A dagger is equal to V D dagger U star. That's easy. That's an easy thing to verify. For example, if you look at the first condition, A dagger A. A means this UD V star. A dagger means V D dagger U star. So V comes here means V star V is identity, that will go. D dagger will come, and then D dagger U star will come. That's the thing. So then what do you need? A dagger A. Then again A should come. So here you just multiply with U D V star. So U star U becomes identity, and finally you will end up with A itself. So that's the thing. So you can verify that these are very easy computations actually. 1 to 4 you can easily verify. Simple matrix multiplication. If you know matrix multiplication, that's easy. Okay. So hence, SVD gives a direct method to compute the pseudo inverse. In fact, there are several efficient algorithms available to compute SVD and hence the Moore-Penrose inverse. This is computationally simple and accurate. In fact, there is something called Golub-Rage algorithm, which is much popular, and it was later modified by people like Tony F. Chan and several other people. Now also people are getting good algorithms to compute SVD. And once you can compute SVD, then you can directly compute the A dagger. Now, why A dagger is important? Let us discuss the importance of Moore-Penrose inverse. For that, I need some technical thing, a geometric structure of Cn. In fact, I will assume this. Even if you don't know this, that is fine. For every vector in Cn, I mean, some n tuples of the form Z1 up to Zn. So you take Z and W, the inner product is defined like this, summation j equal to 1 to n Zj bar Wj. If you don't know this, that is fine, but this is only just like something which behaves like a dot product, that's all, nothing more. The properties are listed here. It is linear in the second variable, conjugate symmetry is there, Z W bar will be Wz, and positiveness, Zz will be non-negative and Zz equals 0 only when Z equals 0. What is the advantage of this inner product? We get the Euclidean norm. This is the Euclidean norm, summation mod xi square all raised to 1 by 2. This is actually inner product xx all power 1 by 2. So this is induced by this inner product. So this is something which we will use. Okay. Now, Moore-Penrose inverse features. This is very important. Consider the system of linear equations given by Ax equal to B, where B is a given vector on Cn. So B is fixed, A is a m by n matrix, and you have the equation Ax equal to B. By a solution, what do you mean? You need a element x in Cm satisfying this equation, Ax equal to B. So this is a model of m equations in n unknowns. So in general, such an equation need not have a solution. Okay. Now, the first result which we prove is that this equation has a solution if and only if A dagger B equal to B. So here is the first importance of A dagger. So that is very important. If it has a solution, then this should be satisfied. A dagger B should be equal to B. So what do you mean by that? A dagger B equal to B means A dagger B is a solution of this, right? Because instead of x, if you place A dagger B, it's satisfied. It is satisfied. This equation is satisfied. So this equation has a solution if and only if A dagger B is a solution. Remember, this is quite natural because if this is an invertible square matrix, then what is the solution? You just take the inverse. A inverse multiply A inverse here means A inverse B is the solution, right? So in general, A dagger B is the solution. Okay. So here you will lose uniqueness, but still A dagger behaves as an inverse, right? That's why it is called a pseudo inverse. So let us look at the proof. Suppose this is satisfied, A dagger B equal to B. Then it is easy to see that A dagger B is a solution because you can put, instead of x, you can put A dagger B, and it satisfies Ax equal to B. Now conversely, suppose there is a solution x satisfying Ax equal to B. Then you compute A dagger B. A dagger B, what you do, you can replace B by Ax because Ax satisfies Ax equal to B. So you replace Ax by B by Ax. So you have Ax here. So this is A dagger Ax. But the property of A dagger will tell you that A dagger A is A itself. So that is AX. But AX equal to B by this. So this is B. So what we obtained is that A dagger B equal to B. So we proved that this equation has a solution if and only if A dagger B equal to B. Or in other words, this has a solution if and only if A dagger B is a solution. Now we are looking for other solutions. So suppose it has a solution, then A dagger B is always a solution. So next result will tell you that all other solutions X has the form that A dagger B plus some vector of the form I minus A dagger A Y, where Y is some element in CM. This is very important. This is just like you solve the differential equation with some in some situation. You find a particular solution, then you see that it's sum with any other some other general solution will be obtained as some linear combination of this particular solution plus something, right? So that is how it behaves. Okay. So any arbitrary solution is obtained as a linear combination of A dagger B and something here. So here I will use the geometrical structure a little bit. So here is a proof. Suppose X satisfies AX equal to B. And you call P equal to I minus A dagger A. That means whatever coming here, you call it P. Okay. So this is an orthogonal projection. That means P square equal to P star. That is easy because you already know that A dagger A by definition, by the definition of A dagger itself, by the property 4, A dagger A is an orthogonal projection. Therefore, I minus A dagger A is also an orthogonal projection, which you can easily verify that it satisfies P equal to P square equal to P star, where P is equal to I minus A. Now, here is the geometry. If you have an orthogonal projection on a Hilbert space, its null space and range, they are orthogonal to each other. And they will actually give you a decomposition of the Hilbert space as null space of P direct sum, range of P as an orthogonal direct sum. So if you want to prove that something in the range, it suffices to prove that it is orthogonal to null space. Or if you want to prove that something is in the null space, it suffices to prove that it is orthogonal to range, like that. So look at this. This is what we want to prove that. We want to prove X equal to this. In other words, you want to prove that X minus A dagger B is of this form. Or in other words, you want to prove that X minus A dagger B is in the range of this, I minus A dagger B, which we denote by P. So to prove that X minus A dagger B is in the range of P, since P is an orthogonal projection, it suffices to show that X minus A dagger B is orthogonal to the null space of P. That means X minus A dagger B is perpendicular to Z for every Z in the null space of P. So we start from Z in the null space of P. So null space of P means P Z equal to 0. P is I minus A dagger A. So I minus A dagger A Z equal to 0. That means Z equal to A dagger AZ. So this is something we will use. Now we are going to prove that if X is a solution of AX equal to B, X minus A dagger B is perpendicular to Z, where Z is in the null space of I minus A dagger A. So perpendicular means dot product is 0. Here you have inner product is 0. So you look at the inner product, X minus A dagger B, Z. So Z, you know that Z satisfies this. So you can replace this by A dagger AZ. Now you can bring this A dagger A to the first component with a star, but since A dagger A is star is A dagger A itself, so that will come here without any change. So A dagger A acting here with Z. Now you apply here this. This is A dagger AX minus A dagger A dagger B. But you know that here A dagger A dagger is A dagger itself. So this is A dagger B. So what happens? It has a solution. Therefore, A dagger B is X itself. So this becomes 0. Sorry, this is A dagger B itself. So A dagger B is AX. So this is A dagger AX. So this is also A dagger AX. So the difference is 0. This is 0. So 0 with inner product Z is 0. So this is 0. So we proved that X minus A dagger B is orthogonal to the null space of I minus A dagger A. Therefore, it is in the range of I minus A dagger A. Therefore, it is of the form I minus A dagger A y for some y. Okay. So this gives you explicitly all the solutions. So Moore-Penrose inverse, the last couple of properties of Moore-Penrose inverse, which is very important regarding the solutions of Ax equal to B. The first question is, does there exist a solution? That is answered by this. A solution exists only when A dagger B is a solution. The second question, how does all the solutions look like? So that tells you that any solution is of this form, A dagger B plus I minus A dagger A y. So if you know A dagger and B, so you can compute this. Now the third question, what is very special about the solution A dagger B? You know that whenever solution exists, A dagger B is a solution. Okay, it may not be unique, but A dagger B is a solution. What is special about that solution? It is a solution with minimal Euclidean norm. That's again very easy to prove. So what do you mean by minimal Euclidean norm? You take any solution x of this equation, Ax equal to B, then norm of A dagger B, the L2 norm, the Euclidean norm will be less than or equal to norm of x for every such solution Ax equal to. That's again very easy. You know that you compute the inner product between A dagger B and I minus A dagger AY. So simply by computation, this is use linearity in the second variable. So this is A dagger B y minus A dagger B A dagger AY. This is A dagger B y minus, here in the second equation, you have A dagger A here, which you bring into the first place. So it is A dagger A dagger B y. This is A dagger only. Therefore, it is A dagger B y minus A dagger B y, which is 0. That means these two quantities are orthogonal to each other. A dagger B and I minus A dagger AY are orthogonal to each other. Now, last proof, we have seen that any solution x is of the form x equal to this. A dagger B plus I minus A dagger AY. And we have seen that they are orthogonal to each other, right? These two quantities are orthogonal to each other. So what is the meaning of this? So this tells you that this is just like your Pythagorean theorem for right angular matrix. Suppose these two quantities represent some sides of the right angle triangle. So with an angle pi by 2 between them. Then what happens? This is the hypotenuse. So hypotenuse square will be equal to sum of the squares of this by Pythagorean theorem. Similarly, here the magnitude of the hypotenuse, that is norm x2 square, is equal to this square plus this square. So I mean norm of this square plus. So that is Pythagoras theorem. So this, now you look at here, this norm is obtained by adding something to this. And whatever we are adding is a non-negative quantity. Therefore, this will be always less than or equal to this. Therefore, what you obtain is norm of A dagger B will be less than or equal to norm x. So it tells you that Ax equal to B has a solution if and only if A dagger B is a solution. And every solution is obtained in this way. And also, the solution A dagger B is a solution with minimal norm. That is the importance of Moore-Penrose inverse. The final thing, the most important thing, what happens if you don't have a solution? So we have seen all the cases. Now the final case, the worst case, you don't have a solution. So what happens if you don't have a solution? Then also Moore-Penrose inverse is helpful. That is very important. Why it is important? Why it is helpful? Suppose Ax equal to B does not have a solution. You consider A dagger B. You know that A dagger B is our candidate for a solution because A dagger should be some kind of inverse. So A dagger inverse should be our solution. A dagger B should be our solution. But we know that here we don't have any solution. So what is special about A dagger B? What happens? You call x tilde. A dagger B, you call it x tilde. Then you have this. Norm of Ax minus B is always greater than or equal to norm of Ax tilde minus B for every x. That means this x tilde, even though it is not a solution, it minimizes the distance between Ax and B. This is a point at which you attain the minimum distance. All other x, the distance between Ax and B will be greater than or equal to the distance between Ax tilde and B. So this is, even though it is not a solution, it gives you something close to a solution. That is the importance of A dagger B. Again, this can be proved very easily. you can write ax minus b equal to, just add and subtract ax tilde, and you get x tilde is a dagger b. So you have ax minus a dagger b plus a dagger b minus b. You can write it like this. Also, this computation I leave it to you. You can see that these two things are orthogonal to each other. So from a very simple computation. So you can write ax minus b as the orthogonal sum of two vectors. That tells you that, again, the Pythagoras theorem, the norm of this square will be equal to sum of the norm squares of this. That means norm ax minus b square will be equal to norm ax minus ax tilde square plus norm ax tilde minus b square. Again, you look at that. This is a non-negative quantity. You have to add non-negative quantity to this to obtain this. Therefore, this should be not less than or equal to this. So you obtain the important inequality. So this tells you that even though a dagger b does not give you a solution, that is a very important choice for a solution, because in many practical situations you need not have a solution, but it will be enough to have something closest to the solution for being a solution. That will work in the practical situation. So in all such cases, a dagger helps you. So that is the importance of Moore-Penrose inverse. And this solution, that is not a solution, but it is close to a solution. So that is something called as least square solution. So we have seen how SVD is being used to compute Moore-Penrose inverse. And now we have seen why Moore-Penrose inverse are very much important in the mathematical scenario of solving the equations. Okay. Now we are going to see practical applications of single value decomposition. We will be discussing only two contexts, but it does not mean that these are the only places where SVD being applied. But I will just mention only two cases where SVD comes for direct, finds its application quite directly in a straightforward way. Okay. So first of all, you see that our computer screen itself doing a kind of cheating. That means some objects will be shown as white, black, or in several various colors. But what happens exactly here, it gives you a mixture of the colors red, green, and blue only. And they are displayed by extremely small pixels on our screen in a grid-like pattern. And what happens, the saturation of each pixel will trick our brain into thinking that it is a different color. There are only these three colors, but their mixture will give you several kind of colors. Okay. Now, what happens if you are watching an object in the computer screen? What actually gives you this object? So we are giving some pixel values at each point in a grid-like manner. So, for example, So what happens that these pixel values for red, green, and blue in a saturation, so this will give you the entire image. Okay. For example, suppose you have an image of an elephant somewhere. So the whole image will be in a dimension, say 100 by 100 pixel. Then we will be having values of red, green, blue at the points where you need the image of elephant should be. So it is a kind of tricking to our eye or brain. In other words, if you look at closer and closer, you will see that there will be only dot, 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 dot only. That's dot only. So, in some cases. Okay. So what happens is that, so for example, you consider an image of 100 by 100 pixel in dimension. What happens? We input the values of RGB. That means red, green, blue, ranging from the value 0 to 250, depending on the format which you use, or in hexagonal format. In each pixel, you give a value. Okay. Now consider the image of 100 by 100 size in dimension. So we need a 100 by 100 matrix to represent this image. So each image in your monitor is represented by a matrix. What we do, in each pixel you will give value. If somewhere there are no object, means the image of the object does not come at some places, means you give value 0 there. If somewhere its color comes as green, you give 1 for the value green and other 0, like that. So every matrix represents an image, or every image is represented by such a matrix. So you need to give pixel values in a 100 by 100 matrix. That means you have to give 10,000 pixel values, and that is for a gray image. Gray image, what happens? The value of red, green, and blue will be the same. But if you are considering a colored image, you have to give 3 values at each pixel. That means you have to give input 30,000 values in case of a colored image of simply 100 by 100 dimension. But most of the time, this will affect your data storage problem. A typical image, for example, the high definition or standard definition, depending on your computer, a typical image of say 1280 by 1024 dimension demands 39 lakhs 32,160 such pixel values. You can imagine this will lead you to a size of 3.75 MB for a single image. So this is the data storage problem. So you have to compress the image to store in your desktop or store in your computer. So here you can see that this 3.75 MB comes in the blue image because I have put RGB 001. 1 for blue, so it comes in the blue image. That's the nice thing about it. So now I hope you understood the problem of data compression or image compression. So you have to compress this image. Now, how do you compress the image? Using SVD. So SVD in action. Suppose A denotes a big matrix representing an image. Okay? Now you consider the SVD of A. That means UD V A equal to UD V star. Now you only take first column U prime of U and first row V star prime of V star and first entry D prime of D. Okay? Then you compute A prime equal to U prime D prime V star prime. Now what happens? This is again a matrix of the same dimension as A, but this will also, so then this will also represent some image. So this will be a blurred version of the original image. Now we can take the second column and do the same thing. Second column, second row, and second entry, you can do the same thing. Then you will get a better image. I mean, better than the first one. Keep on doing that like this. We can consider first few columns or rows of U, D, and V star to construct an image which you won't be getting the original image, but something closer to that. So this is what usually happens whenever you compress a data, compress an image. Some kind of clarity will be lost, but if it does not affect the quality, whatever you demand, then it's fine, right? But what is the advantage here? The number of rows and columns we use to calculate an approximation of, this is the thing, the number of rows or columns we use, that is something called mode, okay? Modes which we use, okay? So this number is calculated to approximation. This gives you an approximate of an image. So this is something which we do. We fix a mode to obtain a specified level of precision. For example, what is the advantage of this? If you fix a level of precision to be 10 modes in a 100 by 100 matrix, then your U prime will be 100 by 10. That is your, you mean you have to take only 10 columns of U. So your D prime will be 10 by 10 and V star prime you are taking only 10 by, so you are fixing the level to be 10. So then the total computation is 2,100 only, pixels only. Instead of 10,000, we had 10,000 here, right? So this reduces the computation as well as the data storage to a greater extent. Now I will show you some images. So this is something you can see. I hope you can see this. So can you see this image? Hello, all of you can see this image?
Yes, sir. We can see
okay.
the image.
Yeah, you look at the last image.
We can see the well, sir.
Okay, thank you. So you look at the last image in the right bottom of this. This is the original image, okay, which is represented by some matrix A. Now, if we put some mode of 100, then you get the second image. This is the second approximate image. Now you go to 75 modes, then this is another image. They are all different, but representing some closer approximation of the original image. Now, each time you are reducing the modes, so you are getting a somewhat approximation of the previous image. So going like this, if you only use one mode of precision, you will get a blurred image like this. That is not enough for you to represent. This is not enough. This is not. So now it depends on your task where you to fix. So for example, I need this much. Yeah, this much amount of precision is enough for me. That means I can choose this and so on. So this is something we have to do. So this is about a gray image. Now what about a, yeah, so now what about a colored image? Yeah, this is about a colored image. Again, these pictures are not something I drawn, but it came from, I took it from the internet from Brand Matthews. Yeah, here, this is the original image. Now you look at here, this is an approximation with 100 modes of precision. This is with 75 modes. This is with 50 modes. And keep on doing that, you are losing some kind of clarity, right? So here, this much is okay, but here you lose some clarity again. So like this. So this is where you need to choose an optimal mode of precision so that you need some kind of precision as well as some kind of data storage. Okay. So that's all from the image compression problem. Now the final stage where we will talk about another important application of single value decomposition, which is known as principal component analysis, PCA. By the way, this is a very important object for the current scenario of artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular. So where this is very important. So the idea is you have a set of data given to you. Say it is represented by x1, x2, etc., xn, where each xi is in RD. For example, x1, each of them representing some persons, and x1 gives you, say, person number 1, the first person, x2 is the second person, and so on. And each of them has, say, D features like height, weight, and age, and so on. So they are represented by each vector is having D such components. So these data are, nowadays, data is a very important thing to observe. So data is being given, maybe big data analysis and all other things are very important. So the problem here is you have a data x1, x2, xn, where each xi's are in RD. The purpose of principal component analysis is to identify the pattern in data. So for example, if these data are being plotted like points on the plane, can we find a curve which will tell you the data, where the data are lying near to the curve, so that you can study it well. So that is what you say by identify the patterns in data, okay? And understand the variance covariance structure of the data. So if you fit a curve to interpret this data, then there will be some variations and covariance factor coming into picture. That should also be taken care. This is just like you are taking data and predicting the result analysis of an election, general election. So you're taking some data and study the thing, and you fix a curve there. Or nowadays, more important example is the COVID pandemic. You're taking some data and study the behavior of the virus and so on. Finally, you will set a kind of curve fitting. You do some kind of curve fitting. Then you have to also take into account the variance and covariance structure of that data, right? That is also important. Otherwise, you're fitting how good your estimate, that is also the goodness of fit. That those issues are also very important from a statistical point of view. And this is something which we use in the practical life. So this is useful for data reduction. And often, much of the variability of the data can be accounted by a smaller number of principal components. That is very important. So that means you project the data onto the principal direction, and which we call the principal components of the data. And data interpretation, that is also important. This principal component analysis can show the relationship that were not previously suspected. So from a practical point of view, this is very important. Okay. Uh, I have some definitions. If this is not very important, I mean, you can skip these definitions. It is a definition of covariance of xy. So just want to make it rigorous. I just put these definitions here. X and y, you have some notion called covariance of xy using the mean x bar. And variance of x is the covariance of x with x itself. And there is something called covariant matrix associated with every x. Every n by d matrix, there is an associated covariant matrix. So how do you obtain covariant matrix? You take the covariance between the columns of that. So covariance between the columns of that and put it in the, you put it as the entries of the matrix. You will get a d by d square matrix, which is called the covariant matrix, which is actually symmetric matrix. In fact, it is positive definite and so on. So now, let us look at the linear fitting problem. Suppose, let me take the very simplest case. Suppose these are the 4 data I have. I have this one, this point, this point, this point. So I want to fit a curve which represent this data in a decent manner. Suppose I want to, I am projecting it on the y-axis. Suppose x is projected here, y is everything projecting on the y-axis. I mean this vertical axis. Then what happens? That the image of x and image of y. So all the images will lie somewhat near to that, right? Okay. So then what happens? Variance of that will be smaller because they lie closer to each other. The image will lie closer to each other because, so you can see that this image and this image will lie here, somewhere here. Okay. So that means their variance will be smaller if you project it on the y-axis. And also, you know that y-axis is not a good fit of this. It will not represent anything about this because data is lying here, some curve like this, and y-axis has nothing to do with this. So this is not a good fit. This is not good. If you are projecting on the y-axis, not good. So what is the optimal line where you can project it? That's the question. Okay. Now suppose we project it on this line. Then what happens? We are not losing much information, which is somewhat closer to the data. So you can see that they are sitting apart from here. Therefore, the variance of these images will be bigger, or in the sense it should be. So this is how do we interpret this. So you need to project the data onto some line. If you are using it for linear fitting, then you need to project in such a way that the variance is maximum there, because that's our observation here. If you project it somewhere away from here, their variance will be smaller. But if you're projecting something here, their variance will be bigger. So we have to project the points onto the lines which maximize the variance. That is what we call the principal component. So let me define it in a straightforward method. We use these inductions to define principal components. Principal component of x are the uncorrelated projections y equal to x minus mu v. Mu is the centroid, no problem, such that variance y is maximal. We don't have to worry about these definitions. That is technical, but it is very easy. So the first principal component you define to be y1 equal to x minus mu v1, such that variance of y1 is maximal. So by defining the first principal component, the k principal component can be defined in this way. y1, y2, etc., yk are principal components. Then k plus 1, the principal component, can be defined in this way, such that variance is maximized, and the covariance. That's why you need uncorrelated projections, right? So the covariance with all others should be 0 for all h. And this yk, y1, y2, etc., are known as the principal components, and v1, v2, etc., vk plus 1 are called the principal directions. Okay. Now, this is a very important thing from the practical problems. But I want to tell you now how singular value decomposition helps you to compute PCA. And that is a more important part here. Suppose X is an n by d matrix of data points with mu as its centroid of its columns, whatever. Consider the singular value decomposition of X minus mu. You can write as U D V transpose. D is this. So because you have n by d matrix, so D is a diagonal matrix here. Okay. Now, what happens? The D principal components y1, y2 up to yd are given by, explicitly given by, the kth column of ud. Yeah, that's it. So the principal components are given by the kth column of ud, with vk being the kth column of v. So if you know the single value decomposition, the UD, you know UD V transpose. So you take UD and consider the kth column, that will give you the principal components. And consider V and its kth column, that will give you the principal directions. And explicitly, you can compute the variance to be sigma k square by n minus 1, where sigma k's are those which appear here, and covariance is 0. Hence, single value decomposition helps us to compute explicitly the principal components, and it is much useful in principal component analysis. Summary, this is an era of artificial intelligence, in particular machine learning. The mathematical background for these topics includes linear algebra, probability theory, and analysis, and many more. Single value decomposition plays a crucial role in such applications. And my request to the students is to learn the topics like linear algebra, probability theory, analysis, and in a very great, means in a deep extension, in a deep manner, so that you can also find your place in some problems like machine learning and or artificial intelligence. So these are the references. This is an algorithm due to Golub and Rainsy. This is a classical textbook due to Roger I. Horn and C.R. Johnson. And this Brady Matthews, the images I presented are taken from this, this note by Brady Matthews. And I did some courses on Coursera, online courses due to Imperial College very recently. And of course, Wikipedia is a very important source of. So thank you. Let me stop here.